Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this evening. I am Dr. John Spencer, the Interim Director of the Walter and Mary Tuohy Chair of Interreligious Studies and a member of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at John Carroll University. On behalf of the university and the Tuohy Chair, I welcome you to the second of this series of lectures, and for some of you, welcome back to those who joined us last evening. This lecture series, Buddhist Ideals of Human Flourishing, Beauty, Love, and Happiness in Ancient Theravada Buddhism, is this spring's presentation of the Walter and Mary Lectures in Interreligious Studies. These lectures are supported by an endowment provided by Walter and Mary Tuohy. Mr. Tuohy was the Chief Executive Officer of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, the C&O, and given his interest in interreligious studies, he and his wife, Mary, established this chair in 1966. This makes the Tuohy Chair nearly 50 years old and one of the oldest chairs of interreligious studies in American universities. We here at John Carroll are both very grateful to Walter and Mary Tuohy for their generosity and very honored to carry on the practice of engaging different religious traditions in thoughtful, intellectual, and respectful conversations. Our lecturer tonight, and for last night, tonight, and tomorrow, is Dr. Maria Heim, and she will continue that tradition. Let me give you a brief introduction to her background. Dr. Heim graduated from Reed College with a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies of Philosophy and Religion, and from Harvard University with a PhD from the Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies. She is currently an Associate Professor of Buddhist Studies in the Department of Religion at Amherst College. She's received a number of prestigious awards and fellowships, including fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations. Dr. Heim has held numerous positions on boards and committees, including the Buddhist section of the American Academy of Religion, and as Associate Editor for the Journal of Religious Ethics. Dr. Heim has an extensive list of publications. Her most recent book is Forerunner of All Things, Buddhaghosa on Mind, Intention, and Agency, published by Oxford University Press. Her articles have a wide range of topics. A few of these articles are one in Buddhist ethics, another one on the concept of self-loathing, and a third on the ascetics of excess. She has an active speaking schedule with lectures at numerous prestigious universities in the United States, England, Japan, and Singapore. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Heim with us this spring, and I'm anticipating a continuation of a very interesting and informative series of lectures on Buddhism. Last night, Dr. Heim gave us an introduction to the beauty of ancient texts. That beauty comes from looking at the form and context of the texts themselves and the appreciation of those texts by those who heard them in the ancient times. However, she also argued that we today can appreciate the beauty of those ancient texts. Whether we accept the truth of these messages or not, they can still have beauty to us. This takes work on our part as we struggle to understand these texts, but we are rewarded by the recognition of their beauty and by the effect of those texts that they have on us today. Tonight's lecture continues the series with the topic, Varieties of Love in Early Buddhist Texts. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Heim.
So thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction, and I'm very grateful to see so many people here. I'll have to say I was a little worried when I realized I was competing with St. Paddy's Day and that some of you could be out drinking right now, but here you are, and I'm grateful to see you, and I'm happy that you're here. And I'm also just very appreciative of my stay so far here at John Carroll. I've loved meeting the students that I've met and the faculty that I've met, and I appreciate how kind and generous everyone has been. So today I'm going to speak about love. I'm going to be mapping a whole terrain in early Buddhist sources about this arena of human experience. I think love is important on its own terms, but I think thinking through love can help us interpret what we are like as human beings, what we might want to be like as human beings, and what might be possible for us to experience. My central objective, and what I'm going to try to show you, is how Buddhaghosa, the particular figure that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and I spoke a lot about yesterday, configures love as a condition for freedom. So I think perhaps we don't always associate love and freedom, but as you will see tonight, I hope love in this particular Buddhist reading is configured as a disciplinary practice that brings about human freedom. I'm going to be talking about, this figure. Those of you who were here last night saw him. This is Buddhaghosa. And he is a major figure from the 5th century of the Common Era. So he lived about 1,000 years after the Buddha's own time, and occupies this kind of similar stature to something like maybe Augustine or Aquinas, a major, very systematic thinker within the Theravada branch of Buddhism, which you find today in Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia, and increasingly globally. So it's kind of a southern branch of Buddhism, and the biggest commentator in terms of somebody who translated, edited, and commented on a great, huge body of work in this particular tradition in a language called Pali, which is related to Sanskrit, one of the Indic languages. Okay, I'm going to be speaking of 4 kinds of love, one of them very closely and the others more at some distance. And what these are, and I'll go through them in a few minutes one by one, but this is a particular grouping of love. I'm referring to them as love, but they have different descriptions within the Buddhist sources. They're called immeasurables, and I'll explain why in a moment, and also something called the sublime attitudes. And these were something that the Buddhists were speaking about and grouping together and talking about as a set, but you also find other Indian traditions. The Yoga Sutras mention them. You find these 4 kinds of experiences talked about in some of the Indian medical texts. So they seem to have been part of the religious or moral or intellectual milieu of ancient India in a way that's broader than just Buddhism. An important part of what they are, and I'll talk more about this, but that it's important to see them, that they were not principally discussed in the context of ethics. Buddhaghosa doesn't take them in an ethical in direction. He's thinking about them much more as therapeutic practices of a kind of religious practice, a kind of work with the mind, but not as ethical injunctions, although sometimes they are seen to have some ethical implications. So I'm interested in how richly phenomenological and psychological Buddhaghosa's discussion of them is. His treatment of the mind, that we'll see tonight, is in the service of what I would call a therapeutic cultivation of it. And to do that work, the kind of therapy and the changing and restructuring of mental experience that these Buddhist thinkers were interested in, involved a very close sort of observation of human psychological experience. You might call phenomenological in a certain kind of way. That maybe at the beginning I'd give you a little bit of comparison to another tradition. Some of you might be familiar with the 4-fold Greek conception of love, where you have agape, which is a kind of spiritual, unconditional affection and love. We also find that in the New Testament. Eros, romantic love, with all of its conceptions of idealized unity as well as tempestuous passion. Philia, the love found in friendship, entailing reciprocity, loyalty, familiarity. And somewhat less discussed, storge, natural affection. Often the paradigm model of that is that felt by parents for children. And then added, of course, to these 4, in the Christian context, we'd have caritas, or charity, the gracious and self-giving love that is modeled by God's love for humans, where the beloved are loved for their own sake and unconditionally. A kind of deepening, perhaps, within the New Testament of the Greek ideal of agape. And I mention these to suggest that where the Buddhist sources sort of chart these range of experiences, there's some overlap, but also some important differences. Right off the bat, I should tell you, and I hope people don't get up and leave, I won't be talking about eros at all. Unfortunately, I'm not a part of love we're all probably interested in. But eros was not something Buddhaghosa was particularly interested in. In fact, he regards it with some suspicion, as he is writing very much within and for a celibate monastic audience. So I won't be talking about anything related to erotic love tonight. Okay, to go back to our Buddhist varieties of love. Go through them one by one, but first let me talk a little bit about what he meant by referring to them as immeasurables. So one of the names for them is just that these are 4 immeasurables. Buddhaghosa says that each of these, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, that when they are cultivated and when you develop them, that they should pervade in every direction. So you start with those near you and you gradually extend your feelings of love into broader and broader spheres of beings. So the language here is beings rather than just human beings. So the idea is that when it's being cultivated, that you would stop at no object of love. So it just keeps going. And so they're immeasurable in that way. He also has another sense of immeasurable, and that is of familiarity. So the idea that through this kind of mastery of these kinds of love, there's a psychological development of an ever-increasing expansion of habit and practice, that loving kindness, as we implement it and experience it, would never be something in which you could say, I'm done, right, or I'm finished, I've mastered it. So that it's something that could always be further developed in terms of habit. Now, all 4 of these types of love are also called sublime attitudes, or more literally something like divine abidings, although that sounds a little strange in English. But what's being referred to here is that those who inhabit these experiences, who make them part of their way of abiding or living, are said to be experiencing the kind of experiences certain deities are experience in the heaven. So that's a reference to that. Okay, so let's go back to what these are. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what each one of them is, and we'll be going through them more carefully. But let's start with the first one, which is loving kindness. And this is a kind of friendliness towards all beings, wishing them to be happy. All right? Compassion is different. It's the desire that beings not suffer. Sympathetic joy is the taking of great pleasure and happiness in other people's success. And equanimity is a feeling. It's not an absence of feeling. It's a feeling of impartiality. It's not apathy or indifference, but a kind of evenness in one's regard for beings. Now, one of the places where you can see the differences and a little bit how Buddhaghosa is thinking about them is in this passage. It's a little bit dense. This is by another scholar's translation. I didn't feel like I could improve on his translation. There's a lot of nice bits of it. But what Buddhaghosa is doing here is introducing these 4 experiences by connecting them to experiences that might be really ready at hand for a lot of us in terms of thinking about the relationships between parents and children. So he starts off with loving kindness. When the baby is in the womb, the parents think with loving kindness, when will we see our child healthy and endowed with all his major and minor limbs? So this is wishing for, may they be happy, may they be healthy, right? And so in a very natural way, we all want that for a baby coming. Then, he says, this is going to get at compassion, when the tender creature lies on his back and cries and wails because of being bitten by lice or fleas, or because of being bothered by troubled sleep, the parents hear this noise and feel compassion. Right? So it's a different thing than loving kindness. This is when they're suffering, you want it to stop. Furthermore, when the parents observe the youth in his most desirable years, either at the time of play when he runs and races or at the time he sleeps, their minds become tender, like 100 fluffy balls of cotton soaked in the finest clarified butter. The parents' minds are satisfied and joyous. So this is the sympathetic joy, just being so happy at the child's happiness. They have sympathetic joy at that time. Then, when the son is able to provide adornments for his wife and settle in his own house, the parents become even-minded and think, now our son can live on his own. In this way, they have equanimity at that time. So this is there's a certain kind of distance at this kind of love. They don't stop loving him any less, but they're not so wrapped up in his decisions and judgments and experiences in the way that they did when he was younger. So all of these are quite happy experiences where pleasure is being taken in the other in these very concrete ways. And they're also available to many of us. The idea here is that one starts with immediate and concrete love that one has towards one's loved ones, and then in the meditative context, the meditator gradually learns to expand these narrow spheres of emotional reach, and the love should radiate out and become unlimited. Now that you have a sense of the range of the 4 types of love, I'm going to focus on Buddhaghosa's treatment of loving kindness, and I'll be speaking mostly about this first one. He says that it's fourfold. This is one of the definitions he gives of it. It's our capacity to love, so we all have something that has a capacity that, which is, he says, is loving in beings. It's the act of loving, the state of loving, and I think most interestingly, it's the freedom of a loving heart. So this idea that we're going to start moving towards freedom. This is a very relevant idea for the larger therapeutic practice in which all of these experiences are framed, that they're all principally about freedoms from their opposites. In this case, the opposite of love is a hatred that without this opposing force of love controls and constricts our experience. And so the development of loving kindness is to try to get out of this constrictive and slavery that we often have to our anger, resentment, hatred. So loving kindness is the experience of having one's mind or heart free from this shackling. It has a specific thought that comprises its content, which is, may beings be happy, which is the longing that a particular and then eventually all beings be free of hate, affliction, and distress of any sort. Now, just to give you a sense of what the others are before we start seeing the work of love, of this first type of love, compassion and the other immeasurables are also considered in this fourfold way as capacity, act, state, and the freedom that each makes possible. Compassion has the particular thought of wishing that those in misery be free of suffering. It is counter to and freedom from cruelty. Sympathetic joy, and sometimes he says it's also counter to and freedom from apathy, right? Indifference towards people's suffering. Sympathetic joy is the wish that this person is indeed happy, how fine and how good. So taking happiness in the other person's happiness. It is counter to and freedom from envy or discontent. Equanimity is experiencing a sense of impartiality, neutrality, and equality among beings, a quieting of resentment and approval, counter to and freedom from partiality and attachment. It is to be developed, this last equanimity is to be developed only upon the advanced achievement of the first 3 types of love. It is not, again, an indifference or an absence of feeling, but is rather a concerned involvement with the world, but that is yet not marked by joy or attachment in quite the way that the others are. And that's a complicated thing to understand. I think equanimity is probably the most difficult of these to grasp exactly what's going on. Okay, let's see, is this where I want to be? It's hard to have this behind me, but... Okay, so a couple of big points here. To understand what Buddhaghosa is going to do with these different experiences of love, we must first understand how they're placed within his larger schema. Now, Buddhaghosa has things to say about morality, but he understands morality to be largely the foundation or the basis that you sort of have to start on this meditative program that he's going to describe. So you're already assuming that you're going to have a basic condition of of moral practice before you can even begin to meditate and to concentrate. And so where love comes in his larger program or these particular practices, is largely in a therapeutic context of very deep and systematic contemplative practice in which one is engaged in restructuring mental practice and habit. Morality in his text is more a matter of stopping problematic actions, stopping violence, sexual misconduct, lying, and stealing, right? And so if morality is the basic foundation that you have to even start meditating, then the psychological restructuring of cultivating attention, freedom, and insight can properly begin. So this program of disciplinary practices and developing attention and love will yield important payoffs for altering how one will treat people around one. One, we would imagine, would become a kinder and gentler person, hopefully after doing these practices. But the main concern is not ethics, it's the restructuring of the mind to develop freedom and insight. So these are meditation subjects, something that, as Buddhaghosa sees it, you would be instructed by your spiritual advisor to take up as objects of contemplation. So the spiritual advisor, the teacher, or what he calls your good friend, is somebody who knows you better than you know yourself, has your best interests at heart, and discerns aspects of your temperament that might be obscure even to you. So somebody who knows what you need to work on. And then you need to engage in a long-term practice with each of these in sequence, developing them on the foundation of one another, starting with loving kindness, then compassion, then sympathetic joy, and only on a foundation of some level of mastery of the first three, moving on to equanimity. Okay, so to show you what kinds of practices he's advising, suppose your dear friend has advised that you take up the meditation subject of loving kindness. Buddhaghosa recommends that when first setting out, one generate a motivation for this practice by considering the practical advantages of becoming pervaded with loving kindness. And this is the kind of language he's using a lot of. You become pervaded, you become absorbed in it. So the chief advantage, practical advantage, is that one becomes patient and forbearing, and you cease to be preyed upon by your own hatred. Then, to start the practice, you need to locate a concrete particular person on which to begin one's focus of love. You need to get the feeling flowing, if you will. And so you need to start with a person you love easily, and so you can get the love to flow, as it were, and become absorbed in the experience. Now you have to get this first person right, something that will make it easy to start. It's very hard to start right out of the gate with an enemy, right, and start loving them. So you start with somebody that you really genuinely want only the best for. And so he has a number of restrictions on who this person should be. It should not be the enemy, right, somebody you resent or are angry at, nor should it be a person of the opposite sex. He's quite worried about distractions that might elicit. And it shouldn't be towards somebody who's dead, a teacher who died, or somebody who is a good mentor to you, who's no longer with you. The person that you start with must be real, they must be particular, and they must be alive. So on whom should you focus to start? Now here Buddhaghosa recommends that one start with oneself, right? Since the content of loving kindness concentration is, may this being be happy, Buddhaghosa suggests that this is an easy and uncomplicated wish we all have for ourselves. It allows smooth entry into the practice. Now, my students are sometimes surprised by this unproblematic approach to self-love, but Buddhaghosa insists on it, and he quotes the Buddha himself to the effect that one who loves himself will never harm another, which is an important psychological claim to consider. And so here I've given you an image of the Buddha, since we're quoting the Buddha. Now, having pervaded one's own self with thoughts of friendliness and goodwill, the monk who wishes to progress in the practice should continue in what Buddhaghosa starts to call breaking down barriers. And so you need to move beyond self to directing loving kindness first to a dearly loved friend, still starting with what's easy, then to a neutral person, and then finally to a hostile person. It is at the point of the hostile person, however, that Buddhaghosa anticipates potential obstructions in the practice. When contemplating an enemy, somebody who has wronged you, or wronged someone or something you care about, one may well become distracted by resentment, which then crowds out the potential for love. This situation requires an extensive set of techniques and strategies to remedy, for resentment and hatred are, it seems, quite hard to dislodge. And thus we get a detailed cognitive therapy, if you will, of techniques for getting rid of anger, hate, and resentment. Okay, so this is the breaking down of barriers. Start with self, then expand to dearly loved friend, then to neutrals, then to enemies. Now, when trying to dismantle anger and hatred for an enemy, one should first recall the Buddha's admonishments about hate and anger. The Buddha was said to have said, "To repay angry men in kind is worse than to be angry first." Right? So you start thinking again of what the Buddha had taught you, and then you recall that anger towards the enemy only gratifies the enemy since it makes the hater ugly and unfortunate. Now, if that does not work to dismantle the resentment, one should endeavor to find something which he says is controlled or pure in the enemy's character. So you're trying to find something in the person you're angry at that you can admire, something decent about them, which then you could use to begin to build an incipient sense of regard for them. And it can also begin to calm you down. Surely the enemy must have some decent quality that can be the basis of the beginning of some admiration. But Buddhaghosa considers, what should you do if he lacks any redeeming quality? And then Buddhaghosa recommends that the only proper response to that is compassion. So if they lack any redeeming quality whatsoever, they're going to have a hard life of it, right? And so that compassion would be the only kind of response you could have, and then compassion can become the basis for developing a way to love them. Now this might fail, right? So he has a whole range of techniques. I'm just going to go through all of them because he sees that anger is quite difficult to dislodge. The next thing you could do is admonish yourself how unattractive and destructive to oneself one's anger is. That anger is your real enemy here, not the other person. He can remind himself that anger is bad mental karma. It is perilous for his future condition and counter to the therapeutic path he is on. But if the anger still does not subside, then he should review the special qualities of the Buddha's own conduct, right? So thinking of the Buddhas as kind of ideal here, by recalling specific stories from the vast numbers of previous lives that we have about the Buddha when he was a bodhisattva, when he was preparing to become a Buddha, in which he is said to have cultivated a number of perfections. He perfected his virtue. And particularly here, Buddhaghosa thinks you should recall the stories in which the Buddha was perfecting a virtue called forbearance or patience. And we have a lot of stories in which the Buddha was tortured, or in previous lives as a bodhisattva was tortured. His limbs were torn off by violent kings, or he was pierced and punctured by wicked torturers, but never for a second did he allow anger or resentment to come up within him when that was happening. And so when you have that model in front of you, you find it puts your own continued nurturing of petty grievances to shame. But this practice may not suffice, so then the meditator is going to have to practice something else. And here we get a pretty interesting technique or strategy, which is about thinking of the enemy as your mother. And what this involves is a reflection on samsara, or the fact that in Buddhist thinking we've all been part of many, many infinite previous lives before this one. And if that's the case, if our lives, our rebirths go back infinitely in time, the thinking is that we've all been related to each other at some point in that infinite past. So at some point, all of you are different, people here would have been my mother, or my father, or my brother, or my sister. So we've all been interrelated before, if you think about samsara in the long haul. And so then he said just sort of reflect on that for a second. And then once you think about that, think about this enemy here in front of you whom you're angry at, that at one time in some distant past, every likelihood was there that they were your mother. Okay? And so then this is how his language gets, and it's worth quoting at length, I think, here. So then you start thinking about this person as my mother in some distant life in the past carried me in her womb for 10 months, and she removed from me without disgust, as if it were yellow sandalwood, my urine, excrement, spittle, snot, etc. And she played with me on her lap, and she nourished me, carrying me about on her hip. Or if you're thinking about this person possibly as your father, well, he went by goat paths and paths set by piles, etc., to pursue the trade of a merchant. And he risked his life for me by going into battle in double array, by sailing on the great ocean in ships and doing other difficult things. And he nourished me by bringing back wealth by one means or another to feed his children. And as my brother, sister, son, daughter, this person gave me such and such help. So it is unbecoming of me now to harbor hate for him in my mind. Now, these considerations radically alter the meditator's relationship with the enemy. If, in fact, this person was once my mother, she would have done very tender and nurturing things for me. This is not an abstract idea, but a very concrete and specific thought. She would have removed from me without disgust, as if it were yellow sandalwood, my urine, excrement, spittle, snot, etc. Such selfless acts of care of a mother to her baby, or the hardships a father undertakes for his children, are at once commonplace and ordinary, and yet vital to our capacities for love. And by allowing a range of family relationships of care to be imagined, brother, sister, son, or daughter, Buddhaghosa makes it possible for all of us to retrieve some memory or trace of being the recipient of such acts of care, even for those for whom associations with these archetypal models of idealized parenthood may be problematic. Now, having depicted these services so poignantly, the work of this particular contemplative technique is done. Buddhaghosa need only intimate that it is unbecoming to continue to harbor hate. It is worth noting how this technique, in just a few short sentences, radically shifts the meditator's subjectivity in two ways. First, the meditator needs to observe the unseemliness of his hate in the face of such tender nurturance. One must look at oneself in a different way, newly sensitive to the ugliness of his current feeling. And secondly, the contemplation has forced him to see himself, even if momentarily, as a vulnerable baby or child, entirely dependent upon a caregiver's care and nourishment to survive. Recognizing that very vulnerability exposed in total dependence and helplessness of the human infant, and promoting a tenderness towards that vulnerability may well be important conditions for love and being loved. It may be, however, that even this technique is not up to the task of removing resentment, and so Buddhaghosa soldiers on with additional strategies. One might need to, at this point, recall the benefits of, let me just make sure, yes, okay. The benefits of loving kindness, chiefly the freedom of the loving heart, that foster easy sleep and sweet dreams. A person liberated from his own hatred finds himself loved and protected by all, able to concentrate, calm, unfocused, and headed towards the heavens after death. These prudential considerations appeal to the many benefits of being a loving person, but even these may not be enough to dispel one's irritation. So Buddhaghosa recommends a further technique called resolution into elements. This entails breaking down the enemy into various physical and mental parts that comprise a person, such as into the material components, right? Head hair, body hair, nails, skin, teeth. You're thinking, what is your enemy? There are these different parts. And then starting to ask yourself, well, which part is it that I'm angry with? Now, if a person may be seen as nothing more than a collection of constantly changing material and mental phenomena, as Buddhist philosophy suggests it is, then the anger directed at them can find no foothold, no basis on which to fix. And then finally, as a last recourse, should any of the previous strategies fail to dispel the stubborn hatred that can obsess us, Buddhaghosa recommends either the receiving or the giving of a gift to one's enemy. Now, sometimes it can be hard to get your enemy to give you a gift, so it usually winds up meaning that you have to give them a gift. And he thinks this is going to work. If none of the other things have worked, the very act of giving a gift to somebody dispels your anger towards them. Here again, he invokes a concrete and poignant example. He tells us a brief story about a monk who was angered at another monk who kept making him move from his meditation cell. And the angry monk finally gave the monk he was angry with his own precious alms bowl, itself a gift given to him by his mother, whereupon the resentment that had been dogging him vanished. Right? So it's this idea that generosity, it seems, is incompatible with nurturing hatred. Lest these various techniques of dispelling hatred be seen as a digression from the purposes at hand, that is, cultivating concentration with loving kindness as an object of focus, we may rather suggest that these strategies of removal and dispelling are the chief work of love, as it is conceived here. My experience of reading Buddhaghosa is to admire the rather humane way he works out these techniques, always with a realistic eye towards what we are actually like and the petty grudges and resentments we stubbornly nurture. Love is not some lofty abstract ideal, but is rather getting down to the difficult, nitty-gritty brass tacks of confronting our resentments and disaffections. For him, this is the removal of and liberation from the hindrances of rigid thinking, obstructions, confusions, and toxic experience. Now, in the spirit of removal and dismantling, Buddhaghosa calls this stage of developing loving kindness breaking down barriers. Having successfully allayed one's resentment for the hostile person, our meditator should reinforce his loving kindness toward each of his 4 categories of objects: himself, his beloved friend, the neutral, and the enemy, until he encounters no distinctions or barriers in terms of how he feels about the 4. The meditator knows that he has successfully broken down barriers by performing the following test on himself. He imagines that he is with the other 3, and they are all seized by bandits who demand that he choose one of them among them to make for a blood sacrifice. And one of the 4, the self, the beloved friend, the neutral, or the enemy, it has to be put forward. We might think that the right answer is to step forward oneself and offer oneself to the bandits, a kind of self-sacrifice conveying one's love for the others. Instead, Buddhaghosa says that the monk who has successfully broken down all barriers would be unable to offer anyone. Only in this way has he achieved full and complete impartiality towards himself and the others. He perceives the equality of beings and is fully absorbed in love for all. Buddhaghosa does not have much use for self-sacrifice. And this might be in distinction to other forms of Buddhism and other religious traditions. Now, at this point, his contemplation lifts off from the particularities of these 4 people and becomes directed towards beings in an undistinguished and no longer particularized fashion. Buddhaghosa sees this experience as incredibly expansive. Everywhere and equally, the meditator dwells, pervading the entire world with his heart endowed with loving kindness, abundant, exalted, measureless, free from enmity, and free from affliction. Again, with measureless referring to having no limits in the objects of one's love, nor in the habitual familiarity of the experience. Buddhaghosa also emphasizes the freedom love makes possible. For Buddhist thinkers, freedom is not our natural human condition, at least in terms of the kinds of freedom they care most about, which is the freedom from your own toxic mental states and the deluded and self-serving projections on others that this entails. So that is the extended discussion of developing loving kindness. Let me say a bit about how Buddhaghosa prescribes the development of compassion and the others. He has less to say about the other 3 types of love because they are built on the foundation of loving kindness, and once you have achieved what I have just described, the others will flow with much less obstruction. But they are somewhat different feelings. How do you start with compassion? What sort of object or what sort of person will it be easy to get that feeling flowing? Now, compassion, remember, is the wish that someone be free of suffering. I want their suffering to stop. It starts with a concrete particular object, not of oneself in this case, but of someone in abject misery. And this is how he describes that. One should seek out and behold a wretched man, unlucky, unfortunate, in every way a fit object for compassion, unsightly, reduced to utter misery with hands and feet cut off, sitting in the shelter for the helpless with a pot placed before him and a mass of maggots oozing from his arms and legs and moaning. Again, one has to start with the immediate and natural feelings evoked by the concrete object of this contemplation. Who could fail to be moved by such a sight, and who would not automatically be filled with compassion? But Buddhaghosa notes that it may be difficult to come by this helpless and wretched person. Thank heavens, we must hope that such sights are rare. So if you can't find such a person, and you do need the actual sight of this suffering in front of you, you should seek out a convicted criminal, he says, an evildoer, who is eating his last meal before being led to the gallows for his crime. That the person is an evildoer, right, who might, in terms of justice, be responsible for his experience, is not entertained at all, is not of any interest to Buddhaghosa, right? And in fact, it's a further cause for compassion, right? It's not just undeserved suffering that will easily stir our compassion, perhaps even more so of the convicted criminal. And then from there, one gradually expands one's compassion outward to a sphere of eventually all beings, which entails recognizing more subtle forms of suffering that sooner or later it is our human lot to have to experience. Even those apparently fortunate among us will not leave this life without great loss, eventually the loss of our loved ones, our health, and ultimately our lives. This meditation requires a great deal of attention in particular to suffering in all its forms, and the development of a strong yearning to ameliorate it or eradicate it. Compassion then is the freedom from sorrow and also the freedom from cruelty or callousness. What about sympathetic joy? When trying to arouse the meditation of sympathetic joy, one takes the joy and happiness one feels when something good has happened to a loved one and extends the sphere and reach of that feeling. It is an important counter to the envy that normally afflicts us. There are important things to say about this value, and I've discussed this elsewhere in relationship to Adam Smith's interest in sympathy. He has a very subtle moral psychology of sympathy. But finally, and again only on the basis of a strong development of the first three types of love, would you have equanimity, which develops as a kind of equal and impartial regard for beings. Okay, it's described first and foremost as a kind of peace. So that's the basic picture, and of what Buddhaghosa is doing in this text. There's more subtleties, but I'm going to leave him there for the moment. And I want to find another angle into thinking about this through some of the critics, or at least one critic, of universal love. And so perhaps most vocally, a famous critic of universal love is Sigmund Freud. And he's arguing strongly and vehemently against the notion of, or at least the ethical ideal of universal love, on the basis of a very different kind of psychology than what I've been describing. Now, Freud has a number of criticisms of universal love. I'll just go through some of them. He argues that universal love is fundamentally counter to our nature. As a duty, it is an imposition that demands too much, and that very often our neighbors or enemies are all too often unworthy of our love. He argues that love requires specific duties of us, and these we must take seriously and not imagine that we can fulfill them equally to all strangers. He's worried about a love spread equitably and indiscriminately over all inhabitants on earth, that it would be so thinned out and denuded of its strong feelings and the responsibilities that normally attend love, that it would seem to forfeit much of its own value. And there's more. Such an ethical demand, he says, does ethical and psychological harm to us by imposing upon us an unrealizable ideal and then making us feel guilty for failing at it. Perhaps most seriously, he ventured to say that it would be wrong to love strangers on par with loved ones, for my love is valued by my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on par with them. Moral responsibilities and obligations, he felt, would need to be made on a quite different psychological and ethical basis, perhaps on the basis of reciprocity, but certainly on the basis of reason. Now, certainly Christian thinkers, perceiving Christianity to, probably rightly, to be the main target of this critique, have offered various compelling responses to it. And I'm not sure if Buddhaghosa's conception of love escapes all of these charges, but it does, I think, offer an important alternative to Freud's basic picture, and also one that would proceed along somewhat different psychological lines than the Christian defenses of universal love might. So try to give you what some of these might look like as I've thought about it. First, Buddhaghosa does not frame the development of love as an ethical obligation, which seems to be a large part of Freud's objection to it as a moral imperative of universal love, in that he thinks it simply demands too much of us. Buddhaghosa frames it rather as a path for freedom, a path for joy and happiness of getting rid of one's mental barriers and antipathies, and which I would imagine would only confound Freud's thinking on this. He did not see love as a therapy or as an answer to the desire and aggression he took to be fundamentally part of our nature. For him, it is the social and religious strictures we impose to counter desire and aggression that make us feel unfree and unhappy. But for Buddhaghosa, love, compassion, and the rest are the answer to this suffering, to the pain we impose upon ourselves and others by our aggression and desire. He would agree with Freud that we are beset with aggression. Note how much it takes in the meditation practice to uproot one's resentment. But he doesn't see this as a fixed and irremediable aspect of our condition. Countering aggression with love is surely very difficult, but he would not agree with Freud that it is impossible. Moreover, Buddhaghosa sees love as infinitely expansive. It's not a limited resource that one must spread out either too thinly to reach all beings, or in a manner which deprives one's loved ones of its effects. Buddhaghosa's returning to its immeasurability keeps love from being a zero-sum game. Also important, perhaps, is that Buddhaghosa offers a genuine alternative to Freud's views on narcissistic self-love and the whole idea that love and care for oneself somehow obviates the genuineness or even possibility of universal other regard. Freud sometimes seems to think that having universal love must require selflessness or even self-sacrifice. For Buddhaghosa, love of self and love of other are necessarily contiguous. They should not be seen in opposition. So from where Buddhaghosa sits, Freud seems guilty of a failure of imagination, where human nature is conceived quite darkly and in rather fixed terms, where love is a finite and jealously guarded commodity, and where freedom can only be conceived in opposition to the requirements of civilization. What I might posit that we've received from Buddhaghosa is a psychologically rich and complex account of our human experience. It is a clear and gimlet-eyed in its reckoning with our deepest resentments, attachments, follies, and hatreds, but then it offers a difficult disciplinary practice that tries to free us from them. It's not about ethics. We have no need to resent it on that account, but rather it is about freedom, something all of us want. But it reconfigures freedom so that freedom is not about achieving liberation from social and moral constraints, but rather a liberation from our own limited and constricting patterns of thought and the dark emotional afflictions that keep us imprisoned.
Questions?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I think that a Buddhist would say that love is the soul's longing for nirvana. So in the Buddhist tradition, is there a sense of agape? You talked about 4 types of love pertaining to the love of one human for another.
Right. I think if they wanted to say that, they would have, and I haven't ever found Buddhaghosa saying that. So the notion of a soul is a problematic idea in Buddhism, and it's this part of this larger nirvanic path, right? That I've been kind of parsing here as freedom. So that it's part of a larger path towards nirvana. But it's just one of the kinds of things you would need. This love is just one of the kinds of things you would need to do among many others to get rid of the obstructions to your experience of nirvana. So it's true, it's a part of a larger soteriological path, a path for salvation. But I'm not sure he would put it quite in the way that you suggested. Okay? Questions? Yes.
I'm interested in this idea of freedom that you've been speaking about. The freedom seems to be a freedom from.
Yes.
A kind of negative freedom, and I don't mean that it's bad.
Right, no, I know what you mean, yeah.
Is there any sense that in Buddhaghosa that there's a freedom to do something?
So I think you're right to see it as very negative. It's a freedom from all this other baggage that you have, you know, this kind of constrictions of your imagination, your projections, your desires, your hatred. So it's a freedom from all of that. And it is described in, quote, these negative terms, although that's not a pejorative aspect of it. But I think within the larger parameters of thought, they thought that once all that other stuff was cleared out of the way, that naturally the mind would be bright and happy. But that's the logic of it. So it's not so much about freedom towards accomplishing this or that. It's about removing other stuff so that naturally you can exist in a way in which you're unshackled by that. But there isn't a lot said about this as positive attainments or something like that. So that, I mean, you're right to think that that's interesting. I think it's interesting too. We have a lot in the literature to suggest what else can happen when other stuff is gone. But it's not, again, I probably wouldn't use the language of freedom too in quite the same way.
Yes, woman right there. Yes.
This is kind of two-part. Were you saying that Buddhists don't believe in souls?
That's right.
So what part is coming back and constantly reoccurring if you're having all these multiple lives?
That's right. So you have to, it's a complicated thing, but you have to understand that even within a single lifetime, right, there's no part of you that's remaining unchanging. So what you are as a person who's developing and changing and your experiences are changing is that even you're a different person now than you were when you were 2 years old. And you're a different person now than you will be when you're an old woman. So even within a single life, what you are is a constantly changing conglomeration of conditions and events that are causally connected to each other, but nothing's enduring in the same, then that is equally true across lives. All right? So what you are is a series of conditioned and conditioning events rather than a permanent substrate of a soul that's traveling and migrating through all the changes that we undergo, both within a lifetime and across lifetimes. That's a good question.
Did you have a second part to that, or something? Other questions, please? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for such an interesting talk, Professor.
Thank you.
This question comes out of a position of complete ignorance. And I know it's probably going to sound naive to you, so I don't want you to give me the kind of speechless scowl I might give
I'll try.
students if they ask me whether St. Augustine of Hippo was actually influential on Western understandings of love. But so bearing this in mind, I mean, what lived impact or legacy do Buddhagosa's writings on love have within Buddhist or South Asian culture? I mean, for whom are these texts transformative, and to what ritual or religious affect?
So there's been long-standing meditative traditions that continue through the present day of people doing this type of meditation practice. More so in Burma than probably anywhere else. It's taken hold of a lot of probably, say, modernist and American Western forms of Buddhism too, where people would be doing this in mindfulness, centers, vipassana centers that you might encounter here in the States. So these traditions, are known and practiced, but again, as meditation practices more than, But I would say within that, I mean, ideals of love are generally ethically, promoted in broader ways that might be based on some of this kind of thinking too. So does that help a little bit? It is a good question, right? Are these ideals that are locked up somewhere in a text, or are they something that are in people's minds?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if this question fits with your talk, but in terms of the meditative tradition and like the Heart Sutra, where is that found in Buddhagosa?
Right, okay, good question. So that is from a completely different form of Buddhism. Okay. It's in one of the foundational Mahayana sutras. And the Theravada tradition is never embraced or adopted or accepted as authoritative. All of those Mahayana, what the Theravada tradition would regard as apocryphal sutras. So it's not. So this is a different tradition of love and compassion than what you have in the whole Mahayana rhetoric of the Bodhisattva's compassion and all of that you start to see with the Heart Sutra. Yes.
Is there a place for confrontation and strife and even war when there are enemies that the Hindu culture has faced through the years? With Muslims that have come and invaded, how do they handle this? Or is this practice for the peaceful people, just like we have pacifists that don't
Sure,
engage in
right.
war?
Well, certainly Buddhists have engaged in warfare, right? And you could say, interestingly, right now that there's a lot of, atrocities being carried out by Buddhists against Muslims today in Burma in particular and in Sri Lanka. So I don't think this is any kind of guard against people being people, right? Or, all the kinds of things we know. This is what Buddhaghosa's frame. Buddhaghosa wrote his book, the Visuddhimagga, for celibate monastics who are not part of the getting and spending and the working and the living that most of the rest of us are involved in. And so he sees it, he's speaking to them and from that context. Buddhist texts, though, other Buddhist texts, the Buddha spoke a lot about what the ideals of statecraft should be. He thought he had a lot to say. He had a lot to say about what a good king is, right? And he had a lot to say about what lay life or ordinary human life, householder life should look like and the ethics of that. And so you just have to locate this in terms of what it is. It's for serious full-time practitioners.
Yes, gentleman over there.
You briefly touched on it in your last question, but could you kind of expand a little bit on what Buddhaghosa would have suggested for like the average citizen, like how to work towards having more loving kind of personality?
Well, he doesn't speak to the average person, right? Now, we could probably, and there are lots of people doing this type of work, trying to create a constructivist, I would call it a kind of constructivist ethics, that you can go back and read Buddhist texts and distill, maybe it might be a selective task, or distill some general principles here, or some actual practices that would serve one well in all sorts of capacities and in all sorts of ways. And that wouldn't be a very hard project, just on the basis of what I've suggested here. I mean, there might be techniques here that you say, well, that makes a certain kind of sense. I could talk myself down from some of my anger on the basis of what he's suggesting here. And certainly, like I said, there's plenty of mindfulness centers of people using these practices for their everyday life who are not celibate monastics by any means, who are just ordinary people who want to bring, some kind of contemplative practice into their lives. So, I don't think that's hard, actually. I think, a lot of it's been done, and a lot of it would be easy to do and people are doing this all the time in a rather selective way, taking what they want from traditions and sort of deploying them in ways that make sense to them. As moderns, we have a lot of freedom to do that, right, in the kinds of contexts that we're working in, interacting and encountering this material.
Perhaps one more question from the student. No one wants to leap into the breach.
Can I ask something?
The lady up here. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. My question is, in the Buddhism, Buddha really talks about that all human beings are going to, life is full of suffering. And we can, and that suffering comes from our desires and our attachments and all those things. And the goal is to really detach ourselves or move away from that. So when we are talking about that, how does Buddhaghosa talk about loving oneself and loving others? So does that mean he talks that when we love others, it is exclusively of attachments?
Well, one way to answer that question is to see all four of them taken together, right? That loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy are the foundation from which then one should go into equanimity, which is more about detachment, right? But I think what he's worried about is if you were to go straight into detachment, right, without a foundation of love, it can too easily slide into apathy or indifference. Right? So there's a fine line between detachment and apathy or indifference. And equanimity is not apathy or indifference. So he sees all this kind of stuff about just this deep interest in beings and their happiness and the love and the compassion